Good evening, everybody. Hi. Misty, Dawn, hello. Phoebe, hi. Miss Deborah, hello. Olivia, hello. Rios, hello. Patricia, everyone, thank you so much for joining me this evening. I'm so glad to see you guys. Hopefully you had a great weekend so far and for a Monday, a pretty good Monday. Marvin, Penny, hello. Irma, Lady Lilith, Teresa, oh my goodness, we got a lot of people. Phoebe, oh, that's okay, honey. You keep yourself safe. You keep yourself safe. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad you could have joined me this evening. Yes, Miss Deborah, my weekend was a good one so far. I had off today, so I'm counting today as my part of my weekend. Hi, everyone. Welcome. If you're new here, welcome for the very first time. You have stumbled upon a book reading, obviously. So we are actually into the first book. We're a few readings now into the first book. But if you happen to miss any of the previous readings, you can actually go onto my YouTube and you can find all of the previous readings that we've done. And they're in sequential order, so you can just go to the playlist and just find them and listen to them in order. Well, Phoebe, just be careful, honey. Keep yourself and your family safe, and we'll be thinking about you. We're sending good vibes your way. So, in fact, when everything's said and done, DM me. Let me know that you're all right. Okay? But for anyone who has been with us before, welcome back. I am so glad to see you. Hopefully you've brought some of your YouTube friends with you and some of your other TikTok friends with you to come watch me live, which would be great. Good. I'll rest a bit easier knowing that you're okay, Miss Phoebe. So, best of luck to you guys. Stay safe. So for anyone who's new, we usually get started at about 8:05 just to give people time to get settled into their comfy clothes, finish up dinner, grab their favorite drink, get comfy before I start reading. And then we'll read for about an hour together. Depending also on how long the chapters are or how short the chapters are, we may read a little bit longer, we may go a little bit shorter. I'll see you later, Miss Susan. Thanks for dropping in, though. We'll see you next time. Hopefully we'll see you next week. But we'll give it about another 5 minutes. Hopefully, so for anyone who participates in Easter, I hope you guys had a great Easter weekend. Hopefully your family members aren't crashing too hard from all of the sugar intake, from all of the chocolate eggs and the bunnies and the big dinners and everything that probably happened this weekend. So that was kind of me today. I was really glad I had Monday off because I was on the couch pretty much all day. I had ambitions about getting stuff done today. I was going to do some laundry. I was going to go for a run or something, do some sort of exercise, and I got out of bed and I was like, oh no, actually, I'm just gonna watch the Great British Baking Show all day and drink water. And that's pretty much what I did all day. Though I knew I had to get up in time for this today, because I wouldn't miss this for the world. If I can help it, I will never miss these readings. So, but yeah, that was my day today. I was a complete and total couch potato, which I've actually had to learn to get comfortable doing from time to time, like just giving myself a day where I'm not doing something and learning to be okay with not doing something. Because normally I'm a very industrious kind of person, like I need to be doing something, I need to be moving. I get that from my mom. My mom is very much like that too, and so I have had to learn how to appreciate not doing things from time to time, just to kind of force myself to just be comfortable existing in the moment. And that's hard to do for a lot of people. I know it's hard for me. That was hard for me to learn how to do. So it's still a work in progress, but the book's coming along. You know, I'm trying not to force writing if I'm just not in the mood to write. Because I've tried doing that. Like last week I wanted to write more than what I did. Like mentally I wanted to write more, but I just ended up, like I'd get on the computer and I'd start writing something out and then my brain would just go, we're not doing this today. So it's going. And because I've never written a book before, I don't know what a good or bad timeline is as far as productivity is concerned. I don't want to push myself to write because I still want to enjoy the process, but at the same time I also don't want to cop out and get lazy with it. So this week, now that like Easter's over and, you know, schedules are gonna kind of go back to normal, like at work and stuff, and especially since this week is going to be a lot of rain in our area for the week, so I'm not going to be outside much. So, you know, it'll be a prime week to get some more writing done. So that's my goal, to get maybe like another whole chapter done. Well, I'm not writing in chapters per se. I'm writing in individual stories, and just however many pages that story takes, that's how, like in this we've got like chapters, like decided chapters, because each of my stories are individual stories and not necessarily linearly linked to each other. So some stories are really short and some are a few pages long. So, you know, it's easier for me. It's easier for me on the computer than to just write freehand, because I find at least fixing things is easier on the computer, instead of having to like go in and either like trying to like scribble something in between lines, or making a separate like list of, on this page I need to make this fix for this thing. I can just go in and edit stuff on the computer as I need to. So for me individually, I find that to be easier than trying to just write stuff freehand. But at the same time, if the mood strikes me to write and I'm not near my computer, that's a little frustrating because I also can't bring my computer with me wherever I go, like at my job. So it's got its gives and takes, just like everything else. You know, it's got its advantages and its disadvantages. So, but all right, what time is it? 8:05? Cool. So I hope you guys are in your comfy jammies, and I hope you have your favorite beverage nearby, because we're going to get started reading. So, and thankfully last week's reading uploaded to YouTube with no problem, so hopefully we will have that same kind of success this week. Yeah, I really should take a journal. If anything, just to write down notes and ideas as they come to me. Because sometimes I'll think about something at work, like, oh, that would be great to add to the story. And then I'll be home and I'm like, I know I wanted to add something to this. And sometimes I can't remember. So that's a good idea. And I have an empty journal here with me at the house. So I think I'm going to start doing that. That's a good idea, Miss Deborah. Thank you. Good idea. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And for anyone who's following along, like if you happen to have this book, we're at chapter 22. So, now the landscape was changing. It was a subtle change, hard to identify at first. The road was narrower and bumpy, apparently no longer tended by road crews. It was harder, suddenly, to balance on the bike as the front wheel wobbled over stones and ruts. One night Jonas fell when the bike jolted to a sudden stop against a rock. He grabbed instinctively for Gabriel, and the new child, strapped tightly in his seat, was uninjured, only frightened when the bike fell to its side. But Jonas's ankle was twisted, and his knees were scraped and raw, blood seeping through his torn trousers. Painfully, he righted himself and the bike and reassured Gabe. Tentatively, he began to ride in daylight. He had forgotten the fear of the searchers, who seemed to have diminished into the past. But now there were new fears. The unfamiliar landscape held hidden, unknown perils. Trees became more numerous, and the forests beside the road were dark and thick with mystery. They saw streams more frequently now and stopped often to drink. Jonas carefully washed his injured knees, wincing as he rubbed at the raw flesh. The constant ache of his swollen ankle was eased when he soaked it occasionally in the cold water that rushed through the roadside gullies. He was newly aware that Gabriel's safety depended entirely upon his own continued strength. When they saw their first waterfall, and for the first time, wildlife. "Plane! Plane!" Gabriel called, and Jonas turned swiftly into the trees, though he had not seen planes in days, and he did not hear an aircraft engine now. When he stopped the bicycle in the shrubbery and turned to grab Gabe, he saw the small, chubby arm pointing toward the sky. Terrified, he looked up, but it was not a plane at all. Though he had never seen one before, he identified it from his fading memories, for the giver had given them to him often. It was a bird. Soon there were many birds along the way, soaring overhead, calling. They saw deer, and once, beside the road, looking at them curious and unafraid, a small reddish-brown creature with a thick tail, whose name Jonas did not know. He slowed the bike, and they stared at one another until the creature turned away and disappeared into the woods. All of it was new to him. After a life of sameness and predictability, he was awed by the surprises that lay beyond each curve of the road. He slowed the bike again and again to look with wonder at wildflowers, to enjoy the throaty warble of a new bird nearby, or merely to watch the way wind shifted the leaves in the trees. During his 12 years in the community, he had never felt such simple moments of exquisite happiness. But there were desperate fears building in him now as well. The most relentless of his new fears was that they would starve. Now that they had left the cultivated fields behind them, it was almost impossible to find food. They finished the meager store of potatoes and carrots they had saved from the last agricultural area, and now they were always hungry. Jonas knelt by a stream and tried without success to catch a fish with his hands. Frustrated, he threw rocks into the water, knowing even as he did so that it was useless. Finally, in desperation, he fashioned a makeshift net, looping the strands of Gabriel's blanket around a curved stick. After countless tries, the net yielded 2 flopping, silvery fish. Methodically, Jonas hacked them to pieces with a sharp rock and fed the raw shreds to himself and to Gabriel. They ate some berries and tried without success to catch a bird. At night, while Gabriel slept beside him, Jonas lay awake, tortured by hunger, and remembered his life in the community where meals were delivered to each dwelling every day. He tried to use the flagging power of his memory to recreate meals, and managed brief, tantalizing fragments, banquets with huge roasted meats, birthday parties with thick frosted cakes, and lush fruits picked and eaten, sun-warmed and dripping from trees. But when the memory glimpses subsided, he was left with the gnawing, painful emptiness. Jonas remembered, suddenly and grimly, the time in his childhood when he had been chastised for misusing a word. The word had been starving. "You have never been starving," he had been told. "You will never be starving." Now he was. If he stayed in the community, he would not be. It was as simple as that. Once he had yearned for choice. Then, when he had had a choice, he had made the wrong one, the choice to leave. And now he was starving. But if he had stayed, his thoughts continued. If he had stayed, he would have starved in other ways. He would have lived a life hungry for feelings, for color, for love. "Hi, Pickleball." Nice of you to join us. And Gabriel? For Gabriel, there would have been no life at all, so there had not really been a choice. It became a struggle to ride the bicycle as Jonas weakened from lack of food, and realized at the same time that he was encountering something he had for a long time yearned to see: hills. His sprained ankle throbbed as he forced the pedal downward in an effort that was almost beyond him. And the weather was changing. It rained for 2 days. Jonas had never seen rain, though he had experienced it often in the memories. He had liked those rains, enjoyed the new feeling of it, but this was different. He and Gabriel became cold and wet, and it was hard to get dry even when sunshine occasionally followed. Gabriel had not cried during the long, frightening journey. Now he did. He cried because he was hungry and cold and terribly weak. Jonas cried too, for the same reasons, and another reason as well. He wept because he was afraid now that he would not be able to save Gabriel. He no longer cared about himself. Chapter 23. Jonas felt more and more certain that the destination lay ahead of him, very near now in the night that was approaching. None of his senses confirmed it, though. He saw nothing ahead except the endless ribbon of road unfolding in twisting, narrow curves. He heard no sound ahead. Yet he felt it, felt that elsewhere was not far away, but he had little hope left that he would be able to reach it. His hope diminished further when the sharp, cold air began to blur and thicken with swirling white. Gabriel, wrapped in his inadequate blanket, was hunched, shivering and silent in his little seat. Jonas stopped the bike wearily, lifted the child down, and realized with heartbreak how cold and weak Gabe had become. Standing in the freezing mound that was thickening around his numb feet, Jonas opened his own tunic, held Gabriel to his bare chest, and tied the torn and dirty blanket around them both. Gabriel moved feebly against him and whimpered briefly into the silence that surrounded them. Dimly, from a nearly forgotten perception as blurred as the substance itself, Jonas recalled what the whiteness was. "It's called snow, Gabe," Jonas whispered. "Snowflakes. They fall down from the sky, and they're very beautiful." There was no response from the child who had once been so curious and alert. Jonas looked down through the dusk at the little head against his chest. Gabriel's curly hair was matted and filthy, and there were tear stains outlined in dirt on his pale cheeks. His eyes were closed. As Jonas watched, a snowflake drifted down and was caught briefly for a moment's sparkle in the tiny, fluttering eyelashes. Wearily, he remounted the bicycle. A steep hill loomed ahead. In the best of conditions, the hill would have been a difficult, demanding ride, but now the rapidly deepening snow obscured the narrow road and made the ride impossible. His front wheel moved forward imperceptibly as he pushed on the pedals with his numb, exhausted legs, but the bicycle stopped. It would not move. He got off and let it drop sideways into the snow. For a moment he thought of how easy it would be to drop beside it himself, to let himself and Gabriel slide into the softness of snow, the darkness of night, the warm comfort of sleep. But he had come this far. He must try to go on. The memories had fallen behind him now, escaping from his protection to return to the people of his community. Were there any left at all? Could he hold on to a last bit of warmth? Did he still have the strength to give? Could Gabriel still receive? He pressed his hands into Gabriel's back and tried to remember sunshine. For a moment it seemed that nothing came to him, that his power was completely gone. Then it flickered suddenly, and he felt tiny tongues of heat begin to creep across and into his frozen feet and legs. He felt his face begin to glow, and the tense, cold skin of his arms and hands relaxed. For a fleeting second he felt that he wanted to keep it for himself, to let himself bathe in sunlight, unburdened by anything or anyone else. But the moment passed and was followed by an urge, a need, a passionate yearning to share the warmth with the one person left for him to love. Aching from the effort, he forced the memory of warmth into the thin, shivering body in his arms. Gabriel stirred. For a moment they were both bathed in warmth and renewed strength as they stood hugging each other in the blinding snow. Jonas began to walk up the hill. The memory was agonizingly brief. He had trudged no more than a few yards through the night when it was gone and they were cold again. But his mind was alert now. Warming himself ever so briefly had shaken away the lethargy and resignation and restored his will to survive. He began to walk faster on feet that he could no longer feel. The hill was treacherously steep. He was impeded by the snow and his own lack of strength. He didn't make it very far before he stumbled and fell forward. On his knees, unable to rise, Jonas tried a second time. His consciousness grasped at a wisp of another warm memory and tried desperately to hold it there, to enlarge it, and pass it on to Gabriel. His spirits and strength lifted with the momentary warmth, and he stood. Again, Gabriel stirred against him as he began to climb. But the memory faded, leaving him colder than before. If only he had had time to receive more warmth from the giver before he had escaped, maybe there would be more left for him now. But there were no purpose in if-onlys. His entire concentration now had to be on moving his feet, warming Gabriel and himself, and going forward. He climbed, stopped, and warmed them both briefly again with a tiny scrap of memory that seemed certainly to be all he had left. The top of the hill seemed so far away, and he did not know what lay beyond. But there was nothing left to do but continue. He trudged upward. As he approached the summit of the hill at last, something began to happen. He was not warmer. If anything, he felt more numb and more cold. He was not less exhausted. On the contrary, his steps were leaden, and he could barely move his freezing, tired legs. But he began, suddenly, to feel happy. He began to recall happy times. He remembered his parents and his sister. He remembered his friends, Asher and Fiona. He remembered the giver. Memories of joy flooded through him suddenly. He reached the place where the hill crested, and he could feel the ground under his snow-covered feet become level. It would not be uphill any more. "We're almost there, Gabriel," he whispered, feeling quite certain without knowing why. "I remember this place, Gabe." And it was true. But it was not a grasping of a thin and burdensome recollection. This was different. This was something that he could keep. It was a memory of his own. He hugged Gabriel and rubbed him briskly, warming him to keep him alive. The wind was bitterly cold. The snow swirled, blurring his vision. But somewhere ahead, through the blinding storm, he knew there was warmth and light. Using his final strength and a special knowledge that was deep inside him, Jonas found the sled that was waiting for them at the top of the hill. Numbly, his hands fumbled for the rope. He settled himself on the sled and hugged Gabe close. The hill was steep, but the snow was powdery and soft, and he knew that this time there would be no ice, no fall, no pain. Inside his freezing body, his heart surged with hope. They started down. Jonas felt himself losing consciousness, and with his whole being willed himself to stay upright atop the sled, clutching Gabriel, keeping him safe. The runners sliced through the snow, and the wind whipped at his face as they sped in a straight line through an incision that seemed to lead to the final destination, the place that he had always felt was waiting, the elsewhere that held their future and their past. He forced his eyes open as they went downward, sliding, and all at once he could see lights, and he recognized them now. He knew they were shining through the windows of rooms, that they were red, blue, and yellow lights that twinkled from trees in places where families created and kept memories, where they celebrated love. Downward, faster and faster. Suddenly he was aware with certainty and joy that below, ahead, they were waiting for him, and that they were waiting too for the baby. For the first time, he heard something that he knew to be music. He heard people singing. Behind him, across vast distances of space and time, from the place he had left, He thought he heard music too, but perhaps it was only an echo. So that brings us to the conclusion of the first book of the series. Naturally, I'm going to keep reading, but so yeah, if you have the individual book, that was such a great read. I hadn't read this book for a very long time. Bits and pieces of it came back to me as I was reading, but I forgot how joyous and hopeful the end of that first book is. It's such a great feeling. So we're going to go ahead and keep on. And the next book, of course, for anyone who knows the series, is called Gathering Blue. So, here we go. And for anyone who's going to see this on YouTube, obviously it's going to be a joint title. So, conclusion of the Giver, beginning of Gathering Blue, or something like that. Anyway, Gathering Blue, Chapter 1. Mother? There was no reply. She hadn't expected one. Her mother had been dead now for 4 days, and Kira could tell that the last of the spirit was drifting away. Mother? She said it again, quietly, to whatever was leaving. She thought that she could feel its leave-taking, the way one could feel a small whisper of breeze at night. Now, she was all alone. Kira felt the aloneness, the uncertainty, and a great sadness. This had been her mother, the warm and vital woman whose name had been Katrina. Then after the brief and unexpected sickness, it had become the body of Katrina, still containing the lingering spirit. After 4 sunsets and sunrises, the spirit, too, was gone. It was simply a body. Diggers would come and sprinkle a layer of soil over the flesh, but even so it would be eaten by the clawing, hungry creatures that came at night. Then the bones would scatter, rot, and crumble to become part of the earth. Kira wiped briefly at her eyes, which had filled suddenly with tears. She had loved her mother, and would miss her terribly, but it was time for her to go. She wedged her walking stick in the soft ground, leaned on it, and pulled herself up. She looked around uncertainly. She was young still, and had not experienced death before. Not in the small, 2-person family that she and her mother had been. Of course, she had seen others go through the rituals. She could see some of them in the vast, foul-smelling field of leaving, huddled beside the ones whose lingering spirits they tended. She knew that a woman named Helena was there, watching the spirit leave her infant, who had been born too soon. Helena had come to the field only the day before. Infants did not require the 4 days of watching. The wisps of their spirits barely arrived, drifted away quickly, so Helena would return to the village and her family soon. As for Kira, she had no family now, nor any home. The cot she had shared with her mother had been burned. This was always done after sickness. The small structure, the only home Kira had ever known, was gone. She had seen the smoke in the distance as she sat with the body, as she watched the spirit of her mother drift away. She had seen the cindered fragments of her childhood life whirl into the sky as well. She felt a small shudder of fear. Fear was always a part of life for the people. Because of fear, they made shelter and found food and grew things. For the same reason, weapons were stored, waiting. There was fear of cold, of sickness and hunger. There was fear of beasts. And fear propelled her now as she stood, leaning on her stick. She looked down a last time at the lifeless body that had once contained her mother, and considered where to go. Kira thought about rebuilding. If she could find help, though help was unlikely, it wouldn't take long to build a cot, especially not this time of year, summer start, when tree limbs were supple and mud was thick and abundant beside the river. She had often watched others building, and Kira realized that she could probably construct some sort of shelter for herself. Its corners and chimney might not be straight, The roof would be difficult because her bad leg made it almost impossible for her to climb, but she would find a way. Somehow she would build a cot. Then she would find a way to make a life. Her mother's brother had been near her in the field for 2 days, not guarding Katrina, his sister, but sitting silently beside the body of his own woman, the short-tempered Solora, and that of their new infant who had been too young to have a name. They had nodded to each other, Kira and her mother's brother, in acknowledgement. But he had departed, his time in the field of leaving finished. He had tykes to tend. He and Solora had 2 others in addition to the one that had brought about her death. The others were still small, their names yet of 1 syllable, Dan and Mar. Perhaps I could care for them, Kira thought briefly, trying to find her own future within the village. But even as the thought flickered within her, she knew that it would not be permitted. Solora's tykes would be given away, distributed to those who had none. Healthy, strong tykes were valuable. Properly trained, they could contribute to family needs and would be greatly desired. No one would desire Kira. No one ever had, except her mother. Often, Katrina had told Kira the story of her birth, the birth of a fatherless girl with a twisted leg, and how her mother had fought to keep her alive. "They came to take you," Katrina said, whispering the story to her in the evening, in their cot, with the fire fed and glowing. "You were 1 day old, not yet named your 1-syllable infant name. Kyr. That's right, yes, Kyr. They brought me food and were going to take you away to the field." Kira shuddered. It was the way, the custom, and it was a merciful thing to give an unnamed, imperfect infant back to the earth before its spirit had filled it and made it human, but it made her shudder. Katrina stroked her daughter's hair. "They meant no harm," she reminded her. Kira nodded. "They didn't know it was me." "It wasn't you. Yet." "Tell me again why you told them no," Kira whispered. Her mother sighed, remembering. "I knew I would not have another child," she pointed out. "Your father had been taken by beasts. It had been several months since he went off to hunt and did not return, and so I would not give birth again. Oh," she added, "perhaps they would have given me one eventually, an orphan to raise. But as I held you, even then, with your spirit not yet arrived, and with your leg bent wrong, so that it was clear you would not ever run, even then your eyes were bright. I could see the beginning of something remarkable in your eyes, and your fingers were long and well-shaped. And strong. My hands were strong," Kira added with satisfaction. She had heard the story so often. Each time of hearing, she looked down at her strong hands with pride. Her mother laughed. "So strong they gripped my own thumb fiercely and would not let go. Feeling that fierce tug on my thumb, I could not let them take you away. I simply told them no. They were angry. Yes, but I was firm. And of course my father was still alive. He was old then, 4 syllables, and he had been the leader of the people, the chief guardian for a very long time. They respected him, and your father would have been a greatly respected leader too, had he not died on the long hunt. He had already been chosen to be guardian." "Say my father's name to me," Kira begged. Her mother smiled in the firelight. "Christopher," she said. "You know that." "I like to hear it, though. I like to hear you say it. Do you want me to go on?" Kira nodded. "You were firm. You insisted," she reminded her mother. "Still, they made me promise that you would not become a burden." "I haven't, have I?" "Of course not. Your hands are strong and wise, and that your head makes up for the crippled leg. You are a sturdy and reliable helper in the weaving shed. All the women who work there say so, and 1 bent leg is of no importance when measured against your cleverness. The stories you tell to the tykes, the pictures you create with words and with thread, the threading you do. It is unlike any threading the people have ever seen, far beyond anything I could do." Her mother stopped. She laughed. "Enough. You mustn't tease me into flattery. Don't forget that you are still a girl, and often willful. And just this morning, Kira, you forgot to tidy the cot even though you had promised." "I won't forget tomorrow," Kira said sleepily, snuggling against her mother on the raised sleeping mat. She pushed her twisted leg into a more comfortable position for the night. I promise. But now there was no one to help her. She had no family left, and she was not a particularly useful person in the village. For everyday work, Kira helped in the weaving shed, picking up the scraps and leavings, but her twisted leg diminished her value as a laborer and even, in the future, as a mate. Yes, the women liked the fanciful stories that she told to amuse restless tykes, and they admired the little threadings that she made, but those things were diversions. They were not work. The sky, with the sun no longer overhead but sending shadows now into the field of leaving from the trees and thorn bushes at its edge, told her that it was long past midday. In her uncertainty, she had lingered here too long. Carefully, she gathered the skins on which she had slept these 4 nights, guarding her mother's spirit. Her fire was cold ashes, a blackened smudge. Her water container was empty, and she had no more food. Slowly, using her stick, she limped toward the path that led back to the village, holding on to a small hope that she might still be welcome there. Tykes played at the edge of the clearing, scampering about on the moss-covered ground. Pine needles stuck to their naked bodies and in their hair. She smiled. She recognized each little one. There was the yellow-haired son of her mother's friend. She remembered his birth 2 midsummers ago, and the girl whose twin had died. She was younger than the yellow-haired one, just toddling, but she giggled and shrieked with the others, playing catch me while I'm running. Tussling, the toddlers slapped and kicked at each other, grabbing toy sticks, flailing with their small fists. Kira remembered watching her childhood companions at such play, preparing for the real scramble of adult life. Unable to participate because of her flawed leg, she had watched from the sidelines with envy. An older child, a dirty-faced boy of 8 or 9 years, still too young for puberty and the 2-syllable name that he would receive, looked over at her from the place where he was clearing underbrush and sorting the twigs into bundles for fire starting. Kira smiled. It was Matt, who had always been her friend. She liked Matt. He lived in the swampy, disagreeable fen, probably the child of a dragger or digger. But he ran freely through the village with his disorderly friends, his dog always at his heels. Often he stopped, as now, to do some chore or small job in return for a few coins or a sweet. Kira called a greeting to the boy. The dog's bent tail, matted with twigs and leaves, thumped on the ground, and the boy grinned in reply. "So you be back from the field?" he said. "What's it like there? Scared, was you? Did creatures come in the night?" Kira shook her head and smiled at him. Younger, 1-syllable tykes were not allowed in the field, so it was natural that Matt would be curious and a little in awe. "No creatures," she assured him. "I had fire, and it kept them away." "So Katrina be gone now from her body?" he asked in his dialect. People from the fen were oddly different, always identifiable by their strange speech and crude manners. They were looked down upon by most people, but not by Kira. She was very fond of Matt. She nodded. "My mother's spirit has gone," she acknowledged. "I watched it leave her body. It was like mist. It drifted away." Matt came over to her, still carrying an armful of twigs. He squinted at her ruefully and wrinkled his nose. "Your cot is horrid burnt," he told her. Kira nodded. She knew that her home had been destroyed, though secretly she had hoped she was mistaken. "Yes," she sighed, "and everything in it? My frame? Did they burn my threading frame?" Matt frowned. "I tried to save things, but it's mostly all burnt. Just your cot, Kira. Not like when there's a big sickness. This time, it just be your mum." "I know," Kira sighed again. In the past there had been sicknesses that spread from one cot to the next, with many deaths. When that happened, a huge burning would take place, followed by a rebuilding that became almost festive, with the noise of workers smearing wet mud over the fitted wooden sides of new structures, methodically slapping it into smoothness. The charred smell of the burning would remain in the air even as the new cots rose. But today there was no festivity. There were only the usual sounds. Katrina's death had changed nothing in the lives of the people. She had been there. Now she was gone. Their lives continued. With the boy still beside her, Kira paused at the well and filled her container with water. Everywhere she heard arguing. The cadence of bickering was a constant sound in the village. The harsh remarks of men vying for power, the shrill bragging and taunting of women envious of one another and irritable with the tykes who whined and whimpered at their feet and were frequently kicked out of the way. She cupped her hand over her eyes and squinted against the afternoon sun to find the gap where her own cot had been. She took a deep breath. It would be a long walk to gather saplings and a hard chore to dig the mud by the riverbank. The corner timbers would be heavy to lift and hard to drag. "I have to start building," she told Matt, who still held a bundle of twigs in his scratched, dirty arms. "Do you want to help? It could be fun if there were two of us." "I can't pay you, but I'll tell you some new stories," she added. The boy shook his head. "I be whipped if'n I don't finish the fire twiggies." He turned away. After a hesitation, he turned back to Kira and said in a low voice, "I heard them talking. They don't want you should stay. They be planning to turn you out, now your mum be dead. They be set on putting you in the field for the beasts. They talk about having draggers take you." Kira felt her stomach tighten with fear, but she tried to keep her voice calm. She needed information from Matt, and it would make him wary to know she was frightened. "Who's they?" she asked in an annoyed, superior tone. "Them women," he replied. "I heard them talking at the well. I be picking up wood chippies from the refuse, and them didn't even notice me listening. But they want your space. They want where your cot was. They aim to build a pen there, to keep the tykes and the fowls enclosed so they don't be having to chase them all the time." Kira stared at him. It was terrifying, almost unbelievable, the casualness of the cruelty. In order to pen their disobedient toddlers and chickens, the women would turn her out of the village to be devoured by the beasts that waited in the woods to forage the field. "Whose was the strongest voice against me?" she asked after a moment. Matt thought. He shifted the twigs in his hands, and Kira could see that he was reluctant to get involved in her problems and fearful of his own fate. But he had always been her friend. Finally, looking around first to be certain he wouldn't be overheard, he told her the name of the person with whom Kira would have to do battle. "Vandara," he whispered. It came as no surprise. Nonetheless, Kira's heart sank. Chapter 2. First, Kira decided it made sense to pretend she knew nothing. She would go back to the site of the cot where she had lived with her mother and begin to rebuild. Perhaps the simple fact of seeing her there at work would deter the women who hoped to drive her away. Leaning on her stick, she made her way through the crowded village. Here and there, people acknowledged her presence with a curt nod, but they were busy, all of them at their daily work, and pleasantries were not part of their custom. She saw her mother's brother. With his son, Dan, he was working in the garden beside the cot where he had lived with Solora and the tykes. Weeds had gone untended while his wife had neared her time, given birth, and died. Then more days had passed, more weeds had flourished, while he sat in the field with his dead wife and infant. The poles that held beans entwined had toppled, and he was angrily setting them upright as Dan tried to help, and the younger tyke, the girl named Mar, sat playing in the dirt at the edge. While Kira looked on, the man slapped his son hard on the shoulder, scolding him for not holding the pole straight. She walked past them, planting her stick firmly in the ground with each step, planning to nod if they acknowledged her. But the small girl playing in the dirt only whimpered and spat. She had tried tasting some pebbles, in the way of toddlers, and had found herself with a mouthful of foul-tasting grit. The boy, Dan, glanced at Kira, but made no sign of greeting or recognition. He was cringing from his father's slap. The man, her mother's only brother, didn't look up from his labor. Kira sighed. At least he had help. Unless she could enlist her small friend Matt and some of his mates, she would have to do all of her work, rebuilding and gardening herself, assuming she was allowed to stay. Her stomach growled and she realized how hungry she was. Rounding the path past a row of small cots, she approached her own location and came upon the black heap of ashes that had been her home. There was nothing left of her household things, but she was pleased to see that the little garden remained. Her mother's flowers still bloomed, and the summer start vegetables were ripening in the sun. For now, at least, she would have some food. Or would she? As she watched, a woman darted out of a clump of nearby trees, glanced at Kira, and then brazenly began to pull carrots from the garden that Kira and her mother had tended together. "Stop it! Those are mine!" Kira moved forward as quickly as she could, dragging her deformed leg. Laughing contemptuously, the woman sauntered away, her hands filled with dirt-encrusted carrots. Kira hurried to the remains of the garden. She set her water container on the ground, pulled up some tubers, brushed the dirt away, and began to eat. Without a hunter as part of their family, she and her mother had not eaten meat except for the occasional small creature they could catch within the boundaries of the village. They could not go to the woods to hunt, the way men did. Fish from the river were plentiful and easy to catch, and they felt no need of anything more. But the vegetables were essential. She was fortunate, she realized, that the garden had not been entirely stripped during her 4 days in the field. Her hunger satisfied, she sat down to rest her leg. She looked around. On the edge of her space, near the ashes, a pile of saplings stripped of their branches was arranged, as if someone had been preparing to help her rebuild. But Kira knew better. She rose and tentatively picked up one of the slender, pliable saplings from the pile. Vandara emerged immediately from the nearby clearing where Kira realized she had been waiting and watching. Kira didn't know where the woman lived or who her hubby and children might be. Her cot was none of those nearby. But she was very much known in the village. People whispered about her. She was known and respected. Or feared. The woman was tall and muscular, with long, tangled hair pulled back roughly and tied with a thong at the back of her neck. Her eyes were dark, and her direct look pierced any calmness that Kira might have felt. The ragged scar that marked her chin and continued down her neck toward her broad shoulder was said to be a remnant of a long-ago battle with one of the forest creatures. No one else had ever survived such a clawing, and the scar reminded everyone of Vandara's courage and vigor as well as her malevolence. She had been attacked and clawed, the children whispered, when she tried to steal an infant creature from its mother's den. Today, facing Kira, she was once again preparing to destroy someone's young. Unlike the forest creature, Kira had no claws with which to fight. She gripped her wooden cane tightly and tried to stare back with no hint of fear. "I've returned to build my cot," she told Vandara. "Your space is gone. It's mine now. Those saplings are mine." "I will cut my own," Kira conceded, "but I will rebuild on this space. This was my father's space before I was born, and my mother's after he died. Now that she is dead, it's mine." Other women emerged from surrounding cots. "We need it," one called. "We're going to use the saplings to build a pen for the tykes. It was Vandara's idea." Kira looked at the woman, who was holding the arm of a toddler roughly. "It might be a good idea," Kira replied, "if you want to pen your little ones. But not on this piece of ground. You can build a pen somewhere else." She saw Vandara lean down and pick up a rock the size of a tyke's fist. "We don't want you here," the woman said. "You don't belong in the village anymore. You're worthless with that leg. Your mother always protected you, but she's gone now. You should go too. Why didn't you just stay in the field?" Kira saw that she was surrounded by hostile women who had come from their cots and were watching Vandara for instructions and leadership. Several, she noticed, had rocks in their hands. If one rock were thrown, others would follow, she knew. They were all waiting for the first. What would my mother have done, she thought frantically, and tried to call wisdom from the bit of her mother's spirit that lived on in her now. Or my father, who never knew of my birth. His spirit is in me too. Kira straightened her shoulders and spoke. She held her voice steady and tried to meet the eyes of each woman in turn. Some lowered their gaze and looked at the ground. That was good. It meant they were weak. You know that in a village conflict that could bring death, we must go to the Council of Guardians, Kira reminded them. She heard some murmurs of assent. Vendara's hand still gripped the rock, and her shoulders were tense, preparing to throw. Kira looked directly at Vendara, but she was speaking to the others now, in need of their support. She appealed not to their sympathy, because she knew they had none, but to their fear. Remember that if conflict is not taken to the Council of Guardians, and if there is a death... She heard a murmur. If there is a death, she heard a woman repeat in an uncertain, apprehensive voice. Kira waited. She stood as tall and straight as she could. Finally, a woman in the group completed the words of the rule. The causer of death must die. Yes, the causer of death must die. Other voices repeated it. One by one they released the rocks. One by one each woman chose not to be a causer of death. Kira began to relax slightly. She waited. She watched. Finally, only Vendara still held her weapon. Glaring, Vendara menaced her, bending her elbow as if to throw. But at last she too dropped the rock on the ground, with a slight harmless toss toward Kira. I will take her to the Council of Guardians then, Vendara announced to the women. I am willing to be her accuser. Let them cast her out. She laughed harshly. No need for us to waste a life getting rid of her. By sunset tomorrow this ground can be ours and she will be gone. She will be in the field, waiting for the beasts. The women all glanced toward the forest, deep in shadows now, the place where the beasts waited. Kira forced herself not to follow their looks with her own eyes. With the same hand that had held the rock, Vendara stroked the scar on her throat. She smiled cruelly. I remember what it was like, she said, to see your own blood pour upon the ground. I survived, she reminded them all. I survived because of my strength. By night start tomorrow, when she feels the claws at her throat, she went on, this two-syllable mistake of a girl will wish she had died of sickness beside her mother. Nodding in agreement, the women turned their backs on Kira and moved away, scolding and kicking all at the small tykes by their sides. The sun was low in the sky now. They would attend to their evening tasks, preparing for the return of the village men, who would need food and fire and the wrapping of wounds. One woman was soon to give birth. Perhaps that would happen tonight, and the others would attend her, muffling her cries and assessing the value of the infant. Others would be coupling tonight, creating new people, new hunters for the future of the village as the old ones died of wounds and illness and age. Kira did not know what the Council of Guardians would decide. She knew only that whether she was to stay or go, to rebuild on her mother's piece of land or to enter the field and face the creatures who were waiting in the forest. She would have to do it alone. Wearily, she sat on the ash-blackened earth to wait for night. She reached for a nearby piece of wood and turned it over in her hands, measuring its strength and its straightness. For a cot, should she be permitted to stay, she would need some sturdy lengths of solid wood. She would go to the woodcutter named Martin. He had been her mother's friend. She could barter with him, maybe offering to decorate a fabric for his wife in exchange for the beams she would need. For her future, for the work which she thought she might earn for her living, she would also need some small, straight pieces of wood. This one was too pliable and would not do, she realized, and dropped it on the ground. Tomorrow, if the Council of Guardians decided in her favor, she would look for the kind of wood she needed. Short, smooth pieces she could fit together at the corners. She was already planning to build a new threading frame. Kira had always had a clever way with her hands. When she was still a tyke, her mother had taught her to use a needle, to pull it through woven fabric and create a pattern with colored threads. But suddenly, recently, the skill had become more than simple cleverness. In one astounding burst of creativity, her ability had gone far beyond her mother's teaching. Now, without instruction or practice, without hesitancy, her fingers felt the way to twist and weave and stitch the special threads together to create designs rich and explosive with color. She did not understand how the knowledge had come to her, but it was there, in her fingertips, and now they trembled slightly with eagerness to start. If only she was allowed to stay. We'll do one more chapter, and then we'll call it a night. Chapter 3. A messenger, bored and scratching at an insect bite on his neck, came to Kira in the dawn and told her that she must report to the Council of Guardians at late morning. When the sun was approaching midday, she tidied herself and went, obedient to his instruction. The council edifice was surprisingly splendid. It remained from before the ruin, a time so far past that none of the people now living, none of their parents or grandparents had been born. The people knew of the ruin only from the song that was presented at the yearly gathering. Rumor said that the singer, whose only job in the village was the annual presentation of the song, prepared his voice by resting for days and sipping certain oils. The ruin song was lengthy and exhausting. It began with the beginning of time, telling the entire story of the people over countless centuries. It was frightening, too. The story of the past was filled with warfare and disasters. Most especially, it was frightening when it recalled the ruin, the end of the civilization of the ancestors. Verses told of smoky, poisonous fumes, of great fractures in the earth itself, of the way huge buildings toppled and were swept away by the seas. All of the people were required to listen each year, but sometimes mothers protectively covered the ears of their smallest tykes during the description of the ruin. Very little had survived the ruin, but somehow the structure called the council edifice had remained standing and firm. It was immeasurably old. Several windows still contained patterned glass of deep reds and golds, amazing things, for knowledge of the way of making such remarkable glass had been lost. Some remaining windows, one in which the colored glass had shattered, were now paned in a thick, ordinary glass that distorted the view through bubbles and ripples. Other windows were simply boarded over, and parts of the building's interior were darkly shadowed. Still, the edifice was magnificent in comparison to the ordinary sheds and cottages of the village. Kira, reporting near midday as she'd been ordered by the messenger, walked alone down a long hallway lit on either side by sputtering flames from tall sconces fed with oil. She could hear the voices of the meeting ahead, behind a closed door, men's voices in muted arguing. Her stick thumped on the wooden floor, and the foot of her flawed leg brushed the boards with a sweeping sound, as if she dragged a broom. Take pride in your pain, her mother had always told her. You are stronger than those who have none. She remembered that now, and tried to find the pride that her mother had taught her to feel. She straightened her thin shoulders and smoothed the folds of her coarsely woven shift. She had washed carefully in the clear stream water and had cleaned her nails with a sharp twig. She had combed her hair with the carved wooden comb that had been her mother's and which she had added to her own small storage sack after her mother's death. Then she had braided her hair, using her hands to interweave the thick, dark strands deftly, tying the end of the wavy plait with a leather strip. Steadying her apprehensions with a deep breath, Kira knocked on the heavy door to the room where the Council of Guardians meeting was already in progress. It opened a crack, spilling a wedge of light into the dim hall. A man looked out and eyed her suspiciously. He widened the opening and gestured her inside. The accused orphan girl Kira is here, the door guard announced, and the muttering subsided. In silence, they all turned to watch her enter. The chamber was huge. Kira had been there before, with her mother, on ceremonial occasions like the annual gathering. Then they had sat with the crowds on rows of benches, facing the stage that was furnished only with an altar table holding the worship object, the mysterious wooden construction of 2 sticks connected to form a cross. It was said to have had great power in the past, and the people always bowed briefly and humbly toward it in respect. But now she was alone. There were no crowds, no ordinary citizens, only the Council of Guardians, 12 men who sat facing her across a long table at the foot of the stage. Rows of oil lamps made the room bright, and each of the men had his personal torch behind him, illuminating stacked and scattered papers that lay on the table. They watched her as she made her way hesitantly up the aisle. Quickly remembering the procedure that she had seen at every ceremony, Kira arranged her hands in a reverent position, cupped together, fingertips below her chin, as she arrived at the table and looked respectfully toward the worship object on the stage. The guardians nodded approvingly. Apparently, it had been the right gesture. She relaxed a bit, waiting, wondering what would happen next. The door guard responded to a second knock and announced a second entry. The accuser Vendara, he called. So, it was to be the two of them. Kira watched as Vendara strode rapidly toward the table until they were side by side, facing the Council of Guardians. It gave her a small feeling of satisfaction to notice that Vendara's feet were bare and her face dirty. The woman had made no special preparations. Perhaps none was necessary. But Kira felt that possibly she had gained a small bit of respect, a small advantage, with her cleanliness. Vendara made the worshipful gesture with her hands, so they were even there. Then Vendara bowed, and Kira saw with a twinge of concern that the guardians nodded their heads toward her. I should have bowed. I must find an occasion to bow. We meet to pass judgment on a conflict, the chief guardian, a white-haired man with a 4-syllable name that Kira could never remember, spoke in an authoritative voice. I had no conflict. I only wanted to rebuild my cot and live my life. Who is the accuser? The white-haired man asked. Of course he knew the answer, Kira thought, but the question seemed to be ceremonial, part of the formal proceeding. It was answered by another of the guardians, a heavy-set man at the end of the table, who had several thick books and a stack of papers in front of him. Kira eyed the volumes curiously. She had always yearned to read, but women were not allowed. Chief Guardian, the accuser is the woman Vendara. And the accused? The accused is the orphan girl Kira. The man glanced at the papers but didn't seem to be reading anything. Accused? What am I accused of? Hearing the repetition of the word, Kira felt a wave of panic. But I can use it as a chance to bow and show humility. She inclined her head and upper body slightly, acknowledging herself as the accused. The white-haired man looked at the two of them dispassionately. Kira, leaning on her stick, tried to stand as straight as possible. She was almost as tall as her accuser, but Vendara was older, heavier, and unflawed except for the scar, the reminder that she had fought a beast and escaped alive. Hideous though it was, the scar emphasized her strength. There we go. Kira's flaw, hideous though it was, the scar emphasized her strength. Kira's flaw carried no illustrious history, and she felt weak, inadequate, and doomed beside the disfigured, angry woman. The accuser will speak first, the chief guardian instructed. Vendara's voice was firm and bitter. The girl should have been taken to the field when she was born and still nameless. It is the way. Go on, the chief guardian said. She was imperfect, and fatherless as well. She should not have been kept. But I was strong, and my eyes were bright. My mother told me. She wouldn't let me go. Kira shifted her weight, resting her twisted leg, remembering the story of her birth, and wondering if she would have an opportunity to tell it here. I gripped her thumbs so tightly. We have all tolerated her presence for these years, Vendara went on, but she has not contributed. She cannot dig, or plant, or weed, or even tend the domestic beasts the way the other girls her age do. She drags that dead leg around like a useless burden. She is slow and eats a lot. The Council of Guardians was listening carefully. Kira's face felt warm with embarrassment. It was true that she ate a lot. It was all true, what her accuser was saying. I can try to eat less. I can go hungry. In her mind, Kira prepared her defense, but even as she did, she felt that it would be weak and whining. She was kept against the rules because her grandfather was still alive and had power, but he is long gone, replaced by a new leader with more power and wisdom. Vendara oozed compliments designed to strengthen her case, and Kira glanced at the chief guardian to see if he was swayed by the flattery, but his face was impassive. Her father was killed by beasts even before her birth, and now her mother is dead, Vendara went on. There is even reason to think that her mother may have carried an illness that will endanger others. No, she was the only one to fall ill. Look at me. I lay beside her when she died, and I am not ill. And the women need the space where their cot was. There is no room for this useless girl. She can't marry. No one wants a cripple. She takes up space and food, and she causes problems with the discipline of the tykes, telling them stories, teaching them games so that they make noise and disrupt the work. The chief guardian waved his hand. Enough, he announced. Vendara frowned and fell silent. She bowed slightly. The chief guardian looked around the table at the 11 others as if he sought comments or questions. One by one they nodded at him. No one said anything. Kira, the white-haired chief guardian said, as a 2-syllable girl, you are not required to defend yourself. Not defend myself? But Kira had planned to bow again, but forgot in her urgency. Now she remembered, but her bow was an awkward afterthought. He waved his hand again, signaling her silence. She forced herself to be still and to listen. Because of your youth, he explained, you have a choice. You may defend yourself. She interrupted again, unable to stop. Oh yes, I want to He ignored her outburst. Or we will appoint a defender on your behalf. One of us will defend you, using our greater wisdom and experience. Take a moment to think about this, because your life may depend upon it, Kira. But you are strangers to me. How can you tell the story of my birth? How can you describe my bright eyes, the strength of my hand as I gripped my mother's thumb? Kira stood helplessly, her future at stake. She felt the hostility beside her. Vendara's breath was quick and angry, though her voice had been silenced. She looked at the men seated around the table, trying to assess them as defenders. But she felt from them neither hostility nor much interest, just a sense of expectation as they waited for her decision. As Kira agonized, her hands pushed their way into the deep pockets of her woven shift. She felt the familiar outline of her mother's wooden comb and stroked it for comfort. With her thumb, she felt a small square of decorated woven cloth. She had forgotten the strip of cloth in the recent confusing days. Now she remembered how this design had come, unbidden to her hands as she sat beside her mother in the last days. When she was much younger, the knowledge had come quite unexpectedly to her, and she recalled the look of amazement on her mother's face as she watched Kira choose and pattern the threads one afternoon with a sudden sureness. I didn't teach you that, her mother said, laughing with delight and astonishment. I wouldn't know how. Kira hadn't known either. Not really. It had come about almost magically, as if the threads had spoken to her, or sung. After that first time, the knowledge had grown. She clutched the cloth, remembering the sense of certainty it had given to her. She felt none of that sureness now. A speech of defense was not within her. She knew she would have to relinquish that role to one of these men, all strangers. She looked at them with frightened eyes and saw one looking calmly, reassuringly back. She sensed his importance to her. She sensed something more. Awareness. Experience. Kira took a deep breath. The threaded cloth was warm and familiar in her hand. She trembled, but her voice was certain. Please appoint a defender, she said. The chief guardian nodded. Jameson, he said firmly, and nodded to the third man on his left. The man with the calm, attentive eyes rose to defend Kira. She waited. All right. That will bring our reading to a close this evening. Thank you all so very much for joining me today. I am so glad that I had the opportunity to read to you. And we also got started on book number 2. So I will be back next week, Monday from 8 to 9-ish, since it's a little after 9 right now. If TikTok gods be good to me, I will be able to upload this to YouTube tomorrow or Wednesday. So for anyone who is seeing this on YouTube later this week, I hope you enjoy. And, like always, please feel free to come and join us for the lives on, oh, that's all right, Ishmael. You know where to find me on YouTube, so you don't miss anything. Please come by and, let me read to you live. It's going to sound the same regardless, but I think it's always so nice to see you guys, here, It's encouraging to see people, and I'm like, I can keep reading because someone new joins, or someone else joins that has been with me for basically day 1 of the readings. So, you're welcome, Pickleball. Thanks for joining us this evening. I hope you enjoyed the reading. So for anyone who's just joining us or has, been around for a little bit, all of these readings from all of the books that I read from, you can find them on my YouTube channel. So just go to my bio. The YouTube link is in my bio. And I hope you guys have a fantastic week. Stay safe, stay hydrated, and I'll see you guys on Monday, 8 to 9 p.m. Bye.